All right, we're back in Romans then, again here today. And let me see here what we're doing right here. I want to, okay. Nope. Okay, back here, and we're down to chapter 4 and verse 13. Now, keep in mind what we're talking about here all the way through chapter 4 is salvation by faith. And Paul is showing we're saved by faith, and then he keeps emphasizing one thing, because they had a situation at Rome. In fact, they had a situation throughout the brotherhood of the first century that we don't have. And that was that they had a great prejudice, probably the greatest prejudice that has existed on the face of the earth. And that is the prejudice between the Jew and the Gentile. And so Paul is having to deal with this prejudice. And the Jews thought themselves so much better than the Gentiles because they felt that they were really a favorite chosen nation of God, which He did choose them. But they felt that this made them something special, something much greater than the Gentiles. So Paul has spent this time, every point that he's making, and he says, now this is the way you're saved. You're saved, salvation by faith. And he said this goes for the Jew and it goes for the Gentile. And every time he makes a point, he comes back and shows, and both Jew and Gentile. And he keeps driving this point home so that the church in Rome, that's composed of both Jew and Gentile, they'll understand that whoever you are, in this generation, at this time, you're saved by faith. And so that's the point, and that's what we're in down to here today. Now, this last week, we talked about this very thing, and we started out and we showed now salvation by works or salvation by faith, because that's what we're really talking about. We'll not belabor the point, but he's comparing salvation by works. There's two ways this can happen. Either you are perfect and never sinned, or you have sinned, but you've paid for your sin. Now, either way that you go about that, there's no grace needed. God doesn't have to do you a favor that you don't deserve, because you really deserve it. You earned it. Now, this system over here, Paul is saying, will not work. Nobody can do this. So now his book of the Romans is talking about salvation by faith. What about the man over here who has sinned, and he can't pay for his sins? And he knows that he can't pay for his sins. So he is hopelessly lost. There's no way this individual can be saved, whether he's Jew, whether he is a Gentile. But here is where God's grace intervenes. God's grace intervenes, and God says, I'm going to do you a favor that you don't deserve, and instead of taking your perfect works and giving you salvation, I'm going to take your faith. And by that faith, I will account it as payment for your sins. I'm going to wipe out your sins on the basis of your faith. Now, a person says, well, what could my faith be worth? Well, let's add it up. What is it? How much is your faith worth when you get down to thinking about it? Now, you got something that's really good. How much is it actually worth? How much would you give me for my faith? We'd say our faith really is not worth anything. It's as far as value is concerned, why, it's not really worth anything. But God says, I'm going to take this, and it's worth something to me. It's worth something to me. I'm speaking now from God's viewpoint. And I'll take your faith, that total, absolute trust that you have in me, and I will account it for your salvation then. But he said, it still takes something to pay for it. It actually takes the blood of Christ. The blood of Christ is what was necessary for our salvation. Now, when Christ prayed in the garden there, that, Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Did God answer his prayers? If it be possible, let this cup pass from me. He did answer his prayer. Now, in what sense? Did Jesus say, in any way, shape, or form, let this cup from me? But he said, if it be possible. Now, if Jesus had not died on the cross, if God had said, okay, Jesus got up, ascended into heaven, he hadn't died on the cross, what would have happened to all mankind? We would have all been lost, wouldn't we? See? And so when Jesus said, if it be possible, he's not saying under any and all circumstances, but if it be possible for me to not have to go through this and still accomplish what you want accomplished, and that is the salvation of mankind, let this cup pass from me. If there's any other way in heaven or on earth to save man from their sins, please don't make me go through this. That's what Jesus was praying. But there was no other way. And passages teach that, and we've already seen this. So now, it takes the blood of Jesus Christ to do this. But we're talking about faith. We're talking about you and me in this particular section here of the book of Romans. And now then, in verses 4 through 24, we studied the first part last week about when did God start saving man by grace through faith. And we raised this question. This is what Paul raised. And that is salvation by faith for the Jews only, or for also the Gentiles? And we talked about the Jews are called a circumcision, the Gentiles are called the uncircumcision. So now, when did God reckon Abraham's faith for righteousness? This was our lesson last week. Did he do it when Abraham was in circumcision or when he was in uncircumcision? So we take Abraham's life. God called Abraham. Abraham takes off, but down when he was 99 years old, that's when he was circumcised. But we looked at these cases. God counted Abraham's faith way back when he left the Ur of the Chaldees. Then again, when Abraham believed God would give him the birth of a son, he counted his faith for salvation. Then when God told him that it's going to be you and Sarah, you're going to be 100, Sarah's going to be 99, and you're going to have a child, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him for righteousness. Finally, Abraham had a son. They were both circumcised. And then afterwards, God then had Abraham to take his son up to offer him. And Abraham did it, and God said that here again, that Abraham believed God, and it was counted for him for righteousness. So now, was Abraham saved by faith while he was uncircumcised or while he was circumcised? See, that's Paul's whole point that we studied last week, and that is both. He was saved in his uncircumcision, he was saved in his circumcision. So Paul is showing circumcision has nothing to do with salvation. Now then, today, he takes the other thing that Jews always camped on, and that is the law. The Jews always said there's two great things that make us Jews better than Gentiles. First of all, we've been circumcised. Paul does away with that. Then God gave us the law, and that means we're special, and we have a way of being saved then, so forth, unlike the Gentiles. So now, we start out and he says, for if they that are of the law are heirs, faith is made void, and the promise is made of none effect. Now, Paul's going to show us how we can take salvation by faith and just void it out. It's useless. And we'll take the promise that God gave to Abraham and we'll void it out. It's useless. He said, for the law worketh wrath, but where there is no law, neither is there transgression. All right, now this is his argument about the law. So let's see what this argument really is here now when it comes down to this law. Now, the promise did not come through the Jewish law. First of all, we need to understand this. This is very, very important. When God gave Abraham the promise, that was about 1,900 years before Christ came. God told Abraham that through thy seed I will bless all nations. So the promise came way before the law ever came into existence. Now then, 430 years after God gave Abraham that promise, God then called Moses and gave Moses the law. So now then we have the law that comes 430 years after the promise. Now, what I want us to do is turn over to Galatians 3, verse 15, and this is a commentary. And let us see what Paul has to say. Let Paul define or teach his own lesson right here. And he's going to tell us about this very thing over here in Galatians that he brings up here in this particular passage of Scripture here. So, as he's teaching this, then over here he says this. He said, Brethren, I speak after the manner of men. Though it be but a man's covenant, yet when it hath been confirmed, no one maketh it void or addeth thereto. Now, he starts out and he said, I want you to understand, even if we're talking about a man's covenant, not God's, but just a man's covenant, once that covenant is made, nobody can come in and void it out or make it or add to it. So I sell Rod my car. I sell him my car for $5,000. He's supposed to pay me $100 a month and so forth. We make a covenant. We make an agreement. It's signed, sealed, and delivered. Okay, Rod has the car. Now what happens if 2 years from now, I get to thinking, I didn't get enough for that car. So I start talking about it and tell people about it. So Roger says, well, I tell you what we'll do, Lowell. We'll just add a new thing in there, and we'll just say Rod has to start paying you $200 a month. Can he do that? Well, Roger says, we'll just void that covenant. We'll just mark it off. We're just going to tell Rod, no, it's a no-go. Is that right? No. Even if it's a man's covenant, once a covenant is made, you can't change it. Now, if you look up here, the covenant was made back here 1,900 years before Christ came. Now, Paul's going to say that's when the covenant was made. The covenant was in the promise. God promised there. He calls it a covenant that he made with Abraham. And now he's going to say nobody can change it. So let's continue reading. He said in verse 16, Now to Abraham were the promises spoken, and to his seed. He saith not unto seeds, but as of many, but as of one, and to thy seed, which is Christ. Now this I say, a covenant confirmed beforehand by God, the law, which came 430 years after, doth not disannul, so as to make the promise of none effect. So now, he said, God made the promise. Excuse me. God made the promise to Abraham for the salvation of man. Now he said, 430 years after the promise was made, God made the law with Abraham, made the Jews the law. Now, what did the law do to the promise? Do you see what Paul is saying here? Did it change the promise? Did it add to the promise? Did it take the promise away? What did the law do to the promise? Well, same thing as if I sell Rod my car, $5,000, $100 a month, and so forth. 2 years from now, I come over to Nancy, and I say, Nancy, here's what I want you to do. And so I start telling her some things. Here's what I want you to do. And Nancy said, oh, okay, Lowell, I'll do it. Okay. I've given her a law. What did that do with my covenant with Rod? See? Nothing. Had nothing to do with it. See? And so that's what Paul is trying to get those Jews to see. That law had absolutely nothing to do with your salvation. Your salvation is going to be based on what we have in that promise. So then, he comes down and he says in verse 18, For if the inheritance is of the law, it is no more of promise. Thank you. Now, if the inheritance is of the law, then it's not of the promise. One or the other. Which one is it going to be? See, is the point that he's saying in here. He said, but God hath granted it to Abraham by promise. So now, the inheritance, our inheritance, our salvation, is given to us by promise and not by law. So what did the law do with it? Law had absolutely nothing to do with it. Then the question arises, well, if the law didn't have anything to do with it, what would be your question? What would be your question? Here. Now, if we're saved by the law, the promise of salvation by faith are made void. So the point in this chart is, if you can be saved by the law, you don't need what came either before or after. If you're saved by the law, you don't need the promise of Abraham. If you're saved by the law, you don't need faith in Jesus Christ. If the law is what saves you, then you don't need either one. Now, what would be the next logical question? God gave Abraham the promise, and that's where you get your salvation. God gave Moses the law. Now, how big a deal was the law? Gigantic. Absolutely gigantic. Can't overemphasize how important the law was. God gave the Jews the law. Tremendously important. Tremendously gigantic. Greatest thing in the whole world. What would the next question be? Well, why did he give it? If it's not to save you, if it wasn't to save those Jews, why in the world did God ever give it? That's a legitimate question. And so Paul is going to answer that question. He says then in verse 18, what then is the law? What is it? If it's not given for salvation, he said it was added. Now I want you to stop, look at that word. It was added. Now when you add something, what do you do? In other words, let's take 432. Now I want you to add that up. What would you say? Add it up and give me the answer. You can't add that. 432 is 432. Now if I say 432 and 10, now add that. In other words, I have to add something to my original. Now what is it? He added the law. He added the law to what? The only other thing he talks about in here is the promise, isn't it? God gave Abraham the promise. Then 430 years after the promise, God added to that promise, he added the law. Now the promise provides salvation. What does the law do? Why did he add the law if that's not for salvation? It was added because of transgression. There's the reason. It was added because of sins. That's the reason it was added. Now, as we look at this thing, you look back here and you see that you have the promise of Abraham. And God said, it's through thy seed shall all nations of the earth be blessed. Now, 430 years later, all right, I want to go back and ask you what happened to the Jews from the time of Abraham until the time of Moses. During those 430 years, what happened to the Jewish nation? Did they keep getting better and better and better, or worse and worse and worse? Just worse and worse and worse and worse. So the Jews were deteriorating. Now God's told Abraham, I'm going to use your seed, the Jews. I'm going to use them to bring in the Christ. But the Jews are just deteriorating worse and worse and worse. Now God is going to do something to keep those Jews from just self-destructing, just blowing apart as a nation, becoming so totally rotten that the Christ won't even be able to come through them. God's going to do something to them. Well, what do you do to a child when you have a child and the child is a good child and then the child starts going astray? You take the child and get it a bicycle, and the child is real good, and you tell, now, honey, stay out of the street and don't ride over here and don't ride over there. And all of a sudden you look and you see the child out in the street riding a bicycle. You see it over here, across over there where you told it not to do. What do you do if you're a loving parent? Call the child in and you make a law, don't you? See? You're going to say, don't you do this. If I see you do this one more time, I'm going to take that bike away from you. Now, is the parent trying to just make that child unhappy? Is that what he's doing? Is the parent trying to just upset the life of the child and be mean to the child? Or is the parent loving and the parent is giving a law, but why is the parent giving the law that is really hard for the child to keep? It's for the protection of the child. That's what this says. Because of transgression. He said, I want you Jews to know, God didn't add the law because you were so good. God added the law because you were so bad. And He added the law until the Christ would come. He's trying to keep you under control. So, Paul then shows them there, and Galatians is a good commentary to that. He shows them why the law itself then is given. And of course, this takes the law argument away from the Jews then. Now, he makes this statement then when he talks about the law. So let's go back to Romans 4 and start out here again in verse 13. For not through the law was the promise to Abraham or his seed that he should be heir of the world, but through righteousness of faith. For if they that are of the law are heirs, faith is made void, and the promise is of none effect. For the law worketh wrath. So here's what the law does to you Jews. The law worketh wrath. Now, what happens to that kid in here that when you give it the law, really? It's going to be the same thing that happened to the Jews. Let's look at what the law did. He gave the law to the Jews, and now in Galatians 3:10, Paul tells, here's what the law demands. For as many as are of the works of the law, that would be the Jews, are under a curse. The law is going to bring you under a curse. For it is written, cursed is everyone who continueth not in all things that are written in the book of the law to do them. Now you come back to the child. Child has a bicycle, has freedom, he runs around, does this and that. You tell him not to get in front of there. You try to be reasonable with them. Finally, the child's disobedient, and you lay it down. You cannot ride on the sidewalk. You cannot ride in the street. You cannot ride over in this neighbor's yard. You cannot. And so he gives them a lot of these things that the child cannot do. Now, what do those laws do to that child? Now, the laws are designed to make the child better. Laws are designed with love to make the child better. But what do you know? What happened to your kids? What happened to you when all these laws were given? It just got you in more trouble, didn't it? Because you're out there, you're riding down the sidewalk, and Dad comes out and says, I told you what? I forgot. And they may have forgotten. But what happens? They disobeyed. They're in trouble. whether they intended to or whether they didn't. So once a law is given, whether the law is given to the little girl with her first bicycle, or whether the law is given to the Jews, what does the law demand? Obedience. That's what it demands, is obedience. And what happens to you when you don't obey? You're punished. It may be you're put on restriction. Maybe your bicycle's taken away from you. Depends on how big it is. But what does the law do when somebody's under the law? It works wrath. And so it was with the Jews. The Jews, when they were given the law, did it straighten them up? Now the law was designed to straighten them up. What would have happened to the Jews if the Jews had done everything that the law told them to do? They would have been perfect. That's what the design was. What actually happened to the Jews? They broke the law, and so they were condemned for breaking the law. Now, I want to come back. Why is he dealing with this? We got to come back and always keep this in mind. Why is he dealing with this? He's trying to show the Jews, you are not a special group of people over the Gentiles, because everybody is saved by faith. So, we see that the law was necessary. He said, where there is no law, there's no transgression. You can't be held guilty of a law in the state of Washington if there is no law, can you? Some driving law, if there is no law? No. If the child doesn't have a law of not riding on the sidewalk, can that child break the law by riding on the sidewalk? No. If the child doesn't have a law that you can't ride your bicycle across the street, the child rides the bicycle across the street, does it break the law? No. It's dangerous, but it doesn't break the law. So the law was necessary. The law was necessary to show those Jews, here's what you have to be. Here's the kind of person that you have to be. So the law itself was necessary. That's the whole point that he's getting at here. Now, there's where we'd start on this, Heather, but now then what I want to do is I want to come back now in Romans 4, and we're going to go down to 16. He said, for this cause it is of faith, that it may be according to grace, to the end that the promise may be sure to all the seed, not to that only which is of the law, not to the Jews, but to that which is also of the faith of Abraham, that is the Gentiles, who is the father of us all. Abraham's the father of both Jew and Gentile. A father of many nations have I made thee, God says. Said, before him whom he believed, even God. Now then, he's going to show what belief is. So let's go now rather rapidly. He said, Abraham's faith. Now here's what it is. He's going to demonstrate it. That he believed even God, who giveth life to the dead, and calleth the things which are not as though they were. That is, God is so powerful, God can raise the dead, and God can look into the future, and he can call things that have not happened as though they had already happened. See? So God has the ability to look in the future the same as we have to look in the past. We have to look in the past to state a fact. God can look in the future and state that. Now look at Abraham in verse 18. Who in hope believed against hope. Now Abraham didn't have any hope. Really, he believed against all sensibilities of hope. When God told him to go kill his son, Abraham had hope he would still be blessed. But there's no reason to hope in a situation like that. Let's stop and think about this for just one moment. What is hope? If we define hope. Hope is defined of two things. Remember what they are? Desire plus expectation. That is what it is. You have to desire something, plus you have to expect it to happen in order to have hope. I mean, that's there. Now, there's a lot of things you desire, but you don't have any expectation for. why wouldn't you have any expectation? What are some of the things you might desire? You desire to be as rich as Bill Gates. Are there any reason that you might not expect that? Are there any good reason that somebody could say, look, don't set your hope on that because that's not going to happen because your expectations are too high. It just, you see, yeah, there's lots of reasons that you have for not expecting that. Now, Lindy McDaniel, as many of you know, held a meeting here for us a couple of years ago. His wife died yesterday. Now, is there any reason for Lindy not to have any hope that he will be able to take her out to dinner this next week? Now, would he desire, how much is his desire now to have her back? How much desire does he have? That's all he can think about is that. Now, how much expectation does he have? No. So you say, Lindy, do you hope to be able to take your wife to dinner next week? What would you say about hope? No. He really has no hope. Now, if he was hoping to take her to dinner Tuesday night, we would say Lindy is hoping against hope. See? He's hoping against hope. He has really a desire which is totally opposed and against any expectation that he has. It's hope against hope. Now, this is what Paul is going to draw out the rest of this chapter. He's going to say, this is what Abraham did. Abraham absolutely had no hope. After God told him to offer up Isaac, he had absolutely no hope of his promise ever coming to pass. He's going to take his child, he's going to bleed the blood out of his child, offer it to God. He's going to put the body upon this fire and burn the body to a crisp. What is his hope of that little boy ever having a child? See? What's the expectation?